Chapter 17. The Lands of the Exiled Kindred. As they rode, the prince began reviewing what the imperial scholars had told him about the lands of the kindred, and also what he had been able to glean from forbidden texts in the secret fortress libraries that held the accounts of the generals who had attempted to invade the kindred sanctuary. What it came down to was that while the Empire had far superior numbers, strategists, and resources of war, they could not bring these things to bear on the kindred. The Pass of Rourke forced the Empire to invade through a single, narrow point that thinned what force could immediately be brought to bear. A number of times a sea-based attack had been tried, but the shores that bordered the land were a series of treacherous cliffs and murderous tides, impossible for a large force to navigate. What seagoing the kindred did conduct was run out of secret harbors in hidden bays that were similarly defensible by a small and dedicated force. But even these obstacles the Empire should have been able to overcome with enough time and men. What truly held them off was the ingenuity of the kindred themselves and their enchanted defenses. Any invading army that managed to pass beyond Rourke, through the mountains, and into the land of the kindred found itself wandering aimlessly through lands that turned from desert to forest overnight. Rivers would erupt from bare rock, cutting an army in two. Days and nights were not fixed. Darkness would fall sometimes hours after the sun rose, and sometimes days would continue on for an entire week. The only man who had been able to successfully invade the kindred lands was the Prince of Oxen, Ramael, and only because he had pushed his army with no concern for his men's well-being. Twice he had invaded with a force numbering in the hundreds of thousands and tracked down the exiles, and twice he had been repulsed, his army too worn down by attrition to win the day. The prince had never heard more than wild speculation as to how the kindred were able to manipulate the land. Some said it was an ancient magic that had existed before the Empress had come from across the sea. Others said that one of the servants who had come with her had betrayed her and taken her secrets to the farthest part of the empire. Still others, the most zealous of her followers, insisted that it was the Empress's will to allow the exiled kindred to remain, and that she would, on a day of reckoning, lead an army into the heart of the kindred lands and wipe them from the face of the earth, turning illusion into reality. The prince didn't know what to believe, except that he was about to learn for himself what it was like to travel the seventh principality. Once they had descended from the mountains, he was informed by the exiles that the city of Vale, the nexus of the exiled kindred's power, was located barely more than a full day of travel from the Pass of Rourke. The prince reined in his horse abruptly, and the others all stopped to look at him. "That's impossible," he said in shock. The red-eyed Eshendai, David, laughed. The sound rang out with a rich baritone quality that, again, seemed to mock the prince. "I thought you said he was one of the Most High," the young man said to Leah. "I thought he'd be more intelligent." The prince's blood boiled, and he had to fight to keep his hand from reaching for the dagger at his belt. Tomaz seemed to have read the prince's mind and broke in hastily with a deep rumble. "The magic of the Council of Elders makes it so that anyone without an anchor is unable to see through the protections we have in place. It's the greatest of our defenses against the Empire." David, still chuckling, rode on ahead with Lorna, and the prince followed sullenly, Leah and Tomaz hanging back with him. "What's an anchor?" he asked. "It's a kind of totem, unique to each person who carries it," Tomaz responded. He gave the prince a brief look of interest mingled with excited anticipation. "I wonder what will happen to you without one." "Why can't you give me one?" "What part of unique to each person who carries it didn't you understand, princeling?" Leah asked, cocking an eyebrow at him. "Even if we somehow had a spare anchor, it wouldn't work for you." "Why not?" "An anchor is only given to those who have sworn loyalty to the Council of Elders and the nation of Aemon." "What is Aemon?" "Aemon was the first exiled kindred," Tomaz responded. "He founded the kindred with the help of the land's original inhabitants." "The savages?" the prince asked. Leah and Tomaz exchanged a glance. "I would highly suggest you keep that word to yourself," the big man said. "Most of the kindred are not exiles from the Empire like we are. We joined them, yes, but they have been here for longer than living memory, before the Empress came. The people who live in Vale are largely their descendants, mixed with those like us who they took in." "The exiled servant," the prince said. "What?" Leah asked. "A story," the prince explained, "that I was told growing up. A servant who came over with the Empress when she crossed the sea. He stole one of her greatest secrets and fled, taking refuge in the mountains. I never realized it was these mountains. And the story says he was never found. Aemon, Tomaz said, nodding. That man was Aemon. The prince blinked and found himself in the middle of the strangest forest he had ever seen. Ah! He pulled his horse around so violently that the beast almost kicked him off before he could regain control. The world had changed completely. There was foliage as far as the eye could see, including large trees he had no name for, that dripped long plant ropes that he thought from his reading might be vines. A bird the size of an eagle flew over his head, with a bill made of the colors of the rainbow. There was no sign of the mountains they had just crossed, and heat lay heavy on him like a wet blanket. How are we in a forest? He asked, fighting to keep his voice calm. A forest? Tomaz asked. Yes, a forest. We're not in a forest, Princeling, Leah said. We're walking through a field. As soon as she said the word field, though, the world gave an odd, sideways lurch, as if someone had pulled a tablecloth out from under a table set, leaving all the exiles and their mounts in place, but completely changing the backdrop behind them. The prince saw a field of wheat flowing around them, felt a cool breeze on his cheeks, saw that the sun was dipping down toward the horizon, and then the world lurched back, and it was a forest again. So this is the defense you were talking about. His voice came out shaky and somewhat choked. Yes, Leah responded with a grin, and it looks like it's working. So you don't see that rather large cat over there? The prince asked, pointing off to their right. Nope, and neither do you. No, I see it. It's standing right there, and it's huge. Your mind isn't anchored, Leah said. You see whatever you cobble together from past experiences, things you've read or dreamed or lived as a child, but it's all illusion. Whatever I imagine seeing? The prince asked. Leah nodded. The genius of the defense is that it doesn't change your mind at all, she said. It simply makes the world look like a blank canvas. Your eyes fill it in however they see fit. Your default image of a new and exotic land must be a forest, or maybe a jungle, like we have in the east. Like there used to be south of Tyne before Ricard cleared it. Strange. I would have thought you'd be walking through the corridors of the fortress or the streets of Lucien or something. As soon as she mentioned the fortress, the world gave another lurch, this time so violent that the prince felt his stomach protest and bile rise in his throat. He was now in a long stone corridor, tapestries on either side of him depicting famous battles, a small alcove to his right holding a gaudy golden chalice. The forest, jungle, returned, and the prince abruptly leaned over the side of his horse, feeling he was about to retch. Whoa there, Tomaz said, reaching over and holding onto the neck of the prince's shirt. What did you see that time? Fortress, he managed to get out, breathing heavily, his stomach slowly settling back down. Interesting, Leah said. Is it because I mentioned the Don't say it, the prince said. The world did a half-lurch, but the prince managed to squint his eyes and keep himself in the jungle. How long is it going to take us to get to Vale? We have to camp for the night, and then we'll get there early tomorrow morning. Shadows and light, he said. They lapsed into silence, and the prince noticed that the forest had begun to shift unsteadily at the edges of his vision. A twist in the contours of the land reminded him vaguely of a stream he'd seen in the Elmist Mountains. Keep talking, he pleaded, as a stream suddenly sprang into being and ran alongside them. About what? Tomaz asked. Anchors, the prince said at random. How are they unique? It's the nature of Valerium, Tomaz responded. You mentioned that before. What's Valerium? It's a type of metal, Tomaz began, but he was abruptly cut off by Leah. It's a type of alloy, she corrected. Well, why don't you tell the man about it? Tomaz responded with a grin, motioning her to continue. She smiled apologetically, but kept talking. It's a type of alloy that comes from a special type of metalworking. You take iron ore and combine it with pure Valerium ore, only found in the mines east of the city of Vale. You do it at extraordinary temperatures, and when the alloy cools, what's left behind is then reheated and oxidized, the same way that steel is made, and the result is a pure white metal that is denser than steel and can be honed to a razor's edge. It's powerful, but slightly brittle. A weapon made of Valerium is, in some cases, as much better than the best Tinian steel as steel is over the copper or bronze weapons people used at the beginning of the Communion era, which was nearly a millennium before— No history lessons, the prince said, through a clenched jaw. Why don't you use it then? It's deadly against any kind of magic and stands up well against other weapons, but it's extremely difficult to wield, owing to the fact it's heavier than steel, and, like I said, it's brittle. If it's struck just the right way, the blade can shatter." "What?" the prince asked. "I thought you said it was denser than steel." "It is." Leah's brow furrowed as she continued, apparently trying to remember. "But something about the way the blades are forged. Look, it makes them brittle when it's struck at the right angle. That's all I know. It's also why all Valyrian blades are curved and single-sided. The smaller the surface area, the weaker the blade, for a reason that I think I knew at one point, but I don't remember. Look, daggers made from it are good for throwing, but not much else. They're just too heavy for quick work. And the swords made from it have just never felt right to me. So I stick with steel. I've never had any problems." The prince nodded. He had been trained in single-edged swords and found them easier to wield than their double-edged cousins, but if you could handle daggers the way the girl could, why bother with anything else? "So, anchors are made of Valyrium. How do you make it unique to a person?" he asked. The conversation was helping him keep his mind off the shifting landscape, which had settled for the moment on a narrow mountain pass that must be from the Elmist Mountains, and he wanted to keep it that way as long as possible. "When the metal is forged, the first person to touch a drop of their blood to the anchor becomes linked to it." The prince looked up sharply, and the world spun. He closed his eyes for a second before speaking to let the vertigo pass. "Blood magic?" he asked. "Not the way you think of it," Tomas said. "Blood magic is a corruption of the art the council has perfected," Leah said hotly. "That magic involves blood of others, sacrifices, even sometimes—" "I know," the prince said, and then lowered his voice. "It's me, remember?" She cleared her throat. "I suppose you might know more about it than I do." "I've seen it," he said darkly. To his surprise, the world remained stable, even though he was thinking of a distinct place in his memory. There was a brief silence as both Tomas and Leah seemed to contemplate what it was he was talking about, but neither of them questioned him about it. A moment of silence fell, until finally the girl broke it. "How are the illusions?" she asked. "Good, as long as I don't focus on them." "Well, hold on a bit longer," Tomas said. "They only exist around the borders with the Empire. A few hours into tomorrow, and you'll be fine." "Tomorrow," the prince said weakly. "You're lucky," Leah said. "The enchantments used to cover the whole land south of the mountains, days in every direction. What changed?" "No one knows," Tomas said. "But the world moves on, and when it does, some things start to fail." "What happens when it fails completely? What do you do?" "Hopefully, we have a long time until that happens," the big man said. "But when it does, I pray that we're strong enough to face the Empire on our own." They lapsed into silence, and the prince closed his eyes. It was easier that way, and with his horse obediently following the rest of the group, he was able to remain close. That night they camped in the middle of a lake. Or, at least that's what it looked like to the prince. A lake complete with waves rolling beneath and around his feet, and fish that stared up at him in alarm as he sat on the glassy, blue-green surface. When Tomas asked what he was seeing, the big man seemed to have a sick fascination with the illusions. The prince said as much, and Leah's brother David began to make jokes at the prince's expense, until Leah told him to stop because the prince was looking decidedly green in the face, which, of course, only encouraged another round of jokes from the red-eyed young man about seasickness. The prince was distinctly starting to dislike the man, no matter whose brother he was. In the end, even when David had stopped mocking him, the prince found he couldn't choke down any food, and so he simply curled up in his bedroll and blanket, thankfully both of them still solid objects that did not shift, and closed his eyes. But, in the middle of the night, he woke to find himself back in the Seeker's lair, with the Lord Seeker himself standing at a nearby table, unrolling a long collection of metal implements in a leather sheath. Each implement was longer and sharper than the last, and the prince knew, beyond a doubt, that he would be tortured to death for what he'd done. As this thought solidified in his head, the Seeker pulled out a long, wicked, three-tined instrument, crossed to the prince, and bent to begin his work. In a matter of seconds, he'd woken the rest of the group with his screams. It wasn't until Leah and Tomas came, inexplicably walking through the walls of his prison and shouting at him to close his eyes, that he was even able to grasp what was happening. Tomas grabbed him by the shoulders and was able to convince him to stop screaming, but it was Leah who managed to bring him out of the vision altogether, by unexpectedly taking his hand and holding it tight, giving it a quick, almost apologetic squeeze, and then slapping him so soundly that his ears rang and his brain did a somersault. The shock and the pain blanked out his mind, and suddenly the world resolved into a long, rolling grass plain, with the moon high above them and wind flicking back the girl's hair. "What? How did you do that?" he asked her. "Well, you cock your arm back like this and—" No need to demonstrate." "Good," she said with a sly smile. The wind gusted again and blew her hair back, and his mind seized on the thought and started working again. And, just that quickly, the plain had disappeared and had been replaced by a mountainside, a river, and Leah without any clothing. He recoiled in surprise, thinking she'd be angry, but she just stood there, which, of course, made sense because she couldn't see what he was seeing. Except, it wasn't an illusion this time. It was also real. He felt suddenly extremely guilty about what was happening, and he quickly looked away. "Is everything all right?" Leah asked cautiously, taking a step forward. "Yes," he said. Yes." She reached out toward him, and he jumped back as if she were wielding a burning brand instead of offering a friendly shoulder pat. Keeping his eyes firmly on the ground, he turned, went back to his bedroll, and covered himself with the blankets. "Thank you, but I'm fine now. Time for bed. Good night." For a long moment, there was just silence, and the sound of wind blowing across the plain/mountainside. And then David spoke. "You brought us a half-wit." "Go back to sleep," Leah said. The prince managed, after a time, to sleep as well. And this time he slept until morning, when he was awoken by a huge hand covering his eyes. "Ah! Whoa," said a voice like a crashing waterfall as the prince jumped up and moved to attack the source of the hand. "Don't panic, it's just me. It's Tomas. Don't look around yet. Just remember where you are and what's going to happen when you open your eyes." The prince realized what a fool he'd just made of himself, but then decided that, with his nerves as frayed as they were, he was lucky he hadn't done something truly stupid. He took a deep breath and nodded beneath the hand, steeling himself. "Right, thank you, Tomas." He opened his eyes and found himself in a world covered in a thick white blanket. He must have gasped or made some sign because Tomas tensed and asked him a question, but the words didn't register as more than sound. "Snow," he whispered. And so it was, piled high all around them. He had seen it before, particularly in the streets of Lucien when winter came, but the snow there was fast to melt, and often gray or black with the soot in the sky or the grime on the streets. Here he found himself in the middle of a picture that he had seen when he was barely old enough to walk, a picture of perfect, new-fallen snow. Everything was covered in the soft, white blanket, and it made the world look fresh and clean. "What are you seeing?" He looked up at Tomas and shook his head. "Snow, I think. But like I've only ever seen it in paintings and drawings. And parts of it I don't think I've ever seen. Then again, with all the—" Suddenly the prince was conscious of David standing nearby, and he changed the end of his sentence. "All the stories people have told me, maybe what I'm seeing is some kind of amalgamation." Tomas nodded after a brief hesitation, understanding. "Stories?" David asked. "That's not how it's supposed to work. Only things you've seen can be shown to you, only memories." "He's got an overactive imagination," Leah said, coming up on the prince's other side. "And he certainly does hound people for stories, and tells them to you too, whether you want to hear them or not. We couldn't get him to shut up on the way here. Have you heard this one? Have you heard that one?" "He doesn't seem too talkative now," David said. "He can't have forgotten them all. But then again, stories are as easy to forget as identities." And then the young man's red eyes fixed on the prince's black ones. The raven talisman grew hot, and somehow the prince knew, though he could not say how, that David was playing them all for fools. He knew exactly who Raven was. The prince's hand twitched instinctively, about to move under his drape over to grasp the hilt of his dagger, but he stopped it. The red eyes were watching him closely, and watching him with an unmistakable intelligence that he hadn't seen before. How much did the other man know? How much did he guess? And would he tell the elders in Vale and have him taken? Leah and Tomas were both making up more excuses, but the prince knew it was useless. Somehow something he had done had revealed his true identity. Or maybe David had simply heard rumors of the Prince of Ravens moving south and put the pieces together. He was one of the exiles who operated in the Empire, after all. Who knew what sources of information he had access to? But David didn't speak. He simply nodded and gave the impression that he believed what Leah and Tomas were telling him, all while watching the prince with his fiery red gaze. "Well," Tomas rumbled, Let's get going. Shouldn't keep the elders waiting. Certainly not, said David, resuming his foolish, ne'er-do-well older brother routine. The prince was amazed at how easy the transition was, and how oblivious the others were to it. Though I'll bet 5 golden stags, none of them but Crane remembers you even left. Tomaz and Leah laughed, though it was somewhat forced, and they all went about packing up their temporary camp. As they did, David crossed over to Lorna and spoke to her in a low voice. She made no sign that anything he said had any import to her, but the prince found himself wondering if David had already shared his suspicions with her. Why wasn't he making a bigger deal of it? No exiled in their right mind would let the Prince of Ravens into the lands of the kindred. He means to turn me in. That must be it. But what could the prince do? He couldn't go back, not now. Assuming he found his way through the illusions, a huge assumption, but for argument's sake, say he could, the bridge they'd come over was cut. His only other option was equally impassable. Even if he could make it through any exiled patrols between here and the Pass of Rourke, upon arrival he would have to contend with his brother Ramael, and that was not a confrontation he felt confident he could survive. No, he realized, as he mounted his horse and followed along behind the exiles, the landscape flickering but he too lost in thoughts to notice. There was nothing he could do but go to Vale, and hope the exiles all held their tongues. Another thought came to him then, one that whispered sweetly and deadly in the deepest corners of his mind. David wouldn't need to hold his tongue if the prince found a way to remove it. It was what Joffred would do, what any of the children would do. No, the prince thought harshly, I do not kill unless I have to. And so, as he sat his horse and did his best to ignore the changing world around him, he also did his best to turn a deaf ear to the voice that repeated, over and over again, a single line full of haunting possibility. And what if you have to? But slowly, as they walked along, all of them in the early morning silence that comes from hastily banished sleep, he felt a sense of resignation settle on him, and he knew he would never be able to do it. He wasn't his brothers or sisters. He'd never be able to strike down David in cold blood. He couldn't say why. In fact, he didn't know. Even a week earlier he might have, knowing that his safety depended on it. But that didn't seem to matter anymore. Nothing, really, seemed to matter anymore. They reached Vale some 3 or 4 hours later. The prince knew that they were close because the world, which was currently a long corridor from the fortress, the corridor that led to his mother's audience chambers, in fact, morphed into a forest that didn't shift or change. A forest full of tall trees that had gold and red leaves. How are the leaves this color? The prince asked. The sight was oddly beautiful. You can see them? Tomaz asked, immediately interested. Yes, I think the illusions have stopped. Everything seems steady. What's over there? Tomaz asked, flinging a hand out toward a shrub of some kind. The prince said as much and was rewarded with a cry of praise. By all the gods, David said, sticking a finger in his ear as he looked back at Tomaz. No wonder your throat is so thick. You've managed to stuff a full-grown bull down there. What is it? What's wrong? Leah asked, arriving back from a short scouting trip up ahead in a flurry of leaves. He can see again, Tomaz said, with the too solemn air of a proud parent announcing that his son, blind from birth, had been granted the gift of sight. David sniggered, and Lorna cracked a smile as well. The prince was glad to see that the woman, who hadn't spoken a single word to him since their meeting, at least had a sense of humor. Yes, thank you, the prince said, but the leaves, how are they gold and orange and red? I thought all leaves were green. Not as green as you, apparently, David said, and he spurred his horse forward with a wicked smile. I'm going home. Catch up when you can. Lorna followed him, on her identical, if larger, grey horse, and Leah and Tomaz motioned to the prince to follow as they too took off with cries of excitement. The prince, somewhat irked that his question had been disregarded, nevertheless heeled his horse in the ribs and rode quickly after them. He lay low over the horse's flowing mane, the long brown hair streaming back in the wind of their passing, leaves stirring around them, and a clean, crisp smell in the air that made the prince feel awake and alert. He caught up to the others easily enough. The forest road wasn't made for speed, and as he wound around rocks and trees heading upward on a slight incline, he was soon riding just behind Leah and Tomaz, with David and Lorna a few yards beyond them. When they burst through the tree line, quite suddenly and dramatically, they found themselves looking out over a valley several miles long and wide. A valley filled to the brim with a sprawling, white stone city. "Welcome to Vale," David said. Row after row of tall buildings made of white stone spread out before them, those in the middle of the city taller and grander than those on the outskirts. Trees grew between the houses, and there were no barriers to separate the buildings one from another. No cordoned-off sections where lived the rogues or the elders, no plot of land for the commons to sleep on should they find no housing for the night. It all looked equally grand, just of larger or smaller size. "Where do your elders live? I see no walled-off area for their use." "They live wherever they want," Leah said, watching him with interest. Slowly, what she was saying, and the meaning of it, sank into the prince's mind, and he didn't know what to say. He simply stared out over the city, watching the people go from building to building, all walking down the same streets, all breathing the same air. How did they know who they were? How did they know their place? "Well," David said loudly, interrupting the prince's thoughts, "Lorna and I are going to report to Captain Otmaran. He's expecting us. Stay out of trouble while we're gone." And with that, he kicked his horse into a gallop and rode down the side of the hill into the valley, soon lost to sight down one of the wide boulevards. "So what's the plan?" Tomaz asked, turning to Leah. She looked at him, and then turned to contemplate the prince, eyeing him critically. "Well, I need to report to Jensen. He needs to know we've returned, and I don't doubt he'll have a thing or two to say to me about being so late. Why don't you and Raven spend the night in your cabin, Tomaz? After Jensen, I'll need to make an appearance with the general." "Very good," Tomaz said. "That way you can tell Jensen we have sensitive information that needs to be heard by the elders immediately. Hopefully they can see us within the next few days." "I think that's right," the girl said, "and then we can give our report to them in person." "What about me?" the prince asked. "Am I a prisoner of war? Will your report call me Raven, a runaway son of the Most High, or the Prince of Ravens, a treasure trove of knowledge should you manage to pull it out of me?" For a long time, Leah stood looking blankly at the ground. "I see no reason to make the final choice today," Tomaz said softly, looking now at Leah with tender regard. "Go home. Sleep on it. I think that's what we all could use. And tomorrow, the three of us, together," he looked at the prince, including him, "will decide the best way to move forward. The council will not see us for a few days at least, no matter how urgent we tell them our message is." For a long time, Leah remained silent, and then, slowly, she nodded. Tomaz looked at the prince, and he nodded as well. Like it or not, he couldn't force the issue. "We'll meet tomorrow at midday," Leah said abruptly, "at the bricks." This apparently meant something to Tomaz, because he nodded, and then, without another word, Leah was off, riding down the hill in the same direction David and Lorna had gone. "Well then," Tomaz said cheerily, his tone completely at odds with everything the prince was feeling at that moment, "back to my place." He urged his horse into a brisk walk, and the prince followed suit, moving down the hill at a slight angle to the city. The prince, lost in his thoughts, didn't notice that they were taking a trail that branched off the main road until he looked up and realized that the city was now hidden by a screen of tall pine trees, which, the prince thought harshly, knew what they were doing and had kept their green needles instead of changing them for red and gold. "It's a bit small, and it'll be snug with the two of us," Tomaz said, "but I think it'll be all right." They continued down the road, made of hard-packed dirt, a decent ways. They came to an opening in the trees, and the prince saw a wooden cabin with a tall stone chimney off to their left, in the shade of a large tree with white bark and fading red leaves. A path, which looked as though it were accustomed to being well cared for but was currently in disrepair due to its owner's absence, led from the dirt road up to the front door. The cabin itself was actually rather large, but then again, so was Tomaz. They dismounted, tied their horses to a hitching post, and approached the door, the giant sweeping branches and leaves off the path with his huge boots as they went. When they reached the front door, a slab of wood nearly 10 feet tall, the big man pulled a dull silver key from a breast pocket inside his leather jerkin, inserted it into the dull lock, and pressed down on the latch. The door swung open easily, though the hinges squeaked, another sign that Tomaz had been absent for several months. The prince's first impression upon entering was that he had somehow shrunk. Everything was Tomaz-sized, and as such it made him feel like he'd returned to childhood and had just entered an adult house for the first time. The cabin was made of 3 rooms, the first the main room, which contained a large couch, an equally oversized rocking chair, 2 rugs made of some kind of furry, hairy, animal hide, and several hunting implements that hung about the walls. Visible off to the left was a corner room, taken up almost completely by an enormous bed and an equally gigantic carved wooden dresser, on top of which was a water basin, a mirror, and various shaving implements. Off to the right was a proportionately smaller door that led to a kitchen full of bright, polished silver pots and dark black pans. "Well, this is it," the big man said, and the prince realized that Tomas was nervous to hear what he thought of it all. "Like I said," he continued, "we might be a little squeezed since it's just the 3 rooms, but I've only ever had myself living here, so—" "It's perfect, Tomas," the prince said. And truly it was, in its way. It was no luxury apartment from the fortress of Lucien, but it had a lived-in feel to it that was immediately comforting, and it carried with it the sense of a hard-won, well-lived life. The prince smiled, feeling true affection for the big man, and Tomas, after taking a minute to confirm that this wasn't sarcasm, positively beamed back at him. "Well," Tomas said gruffly, swinging his arms back and forth unnecessarily, "let's, get the bags unpacked, eh?" And with that he nodded once, swung his arms to and fro one more time, and turned and went back to the horses, moving with a jerkiness that was half pride and half self-consciousness. The prince stifled a smile and followed the Aschandel out to the horses. Once they had unpacked, the prince helping Tomas since he really didn't have anything of his own that he wasn't wearing, it was well past midday, and they were both ravenous. Tomas took the prince out back and set him to chopping wood, even though there was a large pile already stowed against the back wall of the cabin. "That's for winter," Tomas rumbled when the prince mentioned it. He'd taken a few minutes to trim his beard properly, instead of the hasty shavings he'd done when on the road, and now he truly did look like a giant warrior woodsman from some half-remembered legend. His long black hair, which the prince noticed for the first time was graying ever so slightly at the temples, had also been combed and pulled back, though it was so thick and wild that combed was a relative term. "Never touch the stockpile unless you have to," Tomas said. "Always chop fresh wood when you can still get it. Now, get me some good-sized logs so we can start a fire and get a stew going. I'm going to see what kind of meat I can find us." He set off into the woods, a longbow nearly 8 feet long over his shoulder. The prince's stomach rumbled, but he ignored it and set to work with the simple axe. It was easier than it looked. As long as he put the wood pieces on the stump the right way, he was strong enough to split them in half with a well-aimed blow. Before long, he'd worked up a sweat, and he was glad to see Tomas coming back through the trees with a small deer and a trio of rabbits. The deer bore evidence of an arrow wound. The rabbits looked like they'd been caught in some kind of trap. "That'll do nicely," the big man said, eyeing the prince's work with the wood. "Take some kindling and 4 or 5 logs and set up a fire like I showed you in the fireplace." The prince did as told, all the while grateful to have something to do to keep his mind off the situation at hand. Imagining what they might be telling members of the exiled kindred about him as he sat there in the woods and helped cook dinner. But as soon as he was in front of the fireplace, trying to remember exactly how to make a fire, those thoughts went away again. In no time at all, it seemed, though by the setting sun it was several hours after they'd entered Vale, Tomas had cleaned the rabbits, chopped and sliced a number of roots and herbs the prince couldn't begin to know the names of, and slid everything into a large black pot that could have been used by the prince as a slightly undersized bathtub. The prince, who had finally managed to construct the fire and get it lit, sat down on the large, well-stuffed couch and found himself idle for the first time since arriving. Immediately, like the bubbles rising to the surface of the stew, his thoughts of David and Leah and the kindred council of elders returned, floating to the top of his mind and releasing little bursts of fear and panic that he knew would build into something dangerous if he didn't dissipate them quickly. "You once said that Leah is a spellblade," the prince said, picking a topic at random. Tomas was bustling around in the kitchen, putting things away and also keeping an eye on the stew. "What does that mean?" "Ah, well, some of it is secret. A ritual is involved that I don't fully understand as I've never been part of it. But the effect is that a man or woman, one that has decided to give their life to the cause of the kindred, is bound to a weapon. It is traditional for Eshendai to do it, though it isn't necessary. I never liked the idea. What happens if my sword breaks? Or it's stolen? No, I've seen too much battle and used too many weapons to pick just one. But Leah and her brother with that sword of his both became spellblades." "But what does that mean, exactly? Why would they bond themselves to a metal?" "Well," Tomas said, "it gives you certain advantages. The metal lends you strength, for one. It's harder to wound a spellblade, and they heal faster. At least, when they're in contact with their weapon, that is. And they can command their weapon to a certain extent, like you've seen Leah do. She can't make it dance or anything, but she can make it do things that no normal dagger should be able to do. Fly farther, hit a target more accurately, return to her if it's close by. Oh, and if anyone she doesn't approve of tries to pick it up, it gives them a nasty burn. The prince instinctively closed his hand into a fist, the hand that had been burned by the girl's dagger when he'd picked it up before escaping to Bainland. The burn had healed well, and there was hardly any mark left behind, but the memory was still clear and strong. Usually spellblades are Eshendai, like I said, and usually they're rogues, not rangers like David and Lorna. Rangers tend to, like me, use the weapon that suits the situation, if they can. Though we all have our favorites, of course, like me and Malachi. What's the difference between a ranger pair and a rogue pair? The prince asked, hoping more conversation would drown his thoughts or else resubmerge them. The big man didn't even turn from stirring the pot this time. He simply spoke in his rumbling mountain-slide voice, knowing it would carry through the cabin no matter how softly he spoke. Rangers, like David and Lorna, are sent out to patrol certain areas, scout out and relay troop movements, sometimes set ambushes or raid along the border if the Empire is mobilizing, as the Prince of Oxen does every few months. Rogues, on the other hand, that's Leah and me, work more subtly. Where Rangers actively fight the Empire, rogues fight passively. Indirectly is maybe the better word. We gather information on members of the High Blood, the Most High, sometimes even the children themselves. And we are saboteurs when the need arises. Saboteurs? The prince asked, interested in spite of himself. Yes, most of it goes unnoticed. Little things, such as delaying this or that project, or convincing certain members of the Empire not to look too closely into the affairs of the kindred. Convincing? Tomas looked over his shoulder. Euphemisms are sometimes for the best. Right. They lapsed into silence again, Tomas stirring the stew and the prince sitting on the couch staring into the fire. He really did feel like a child. His feet dangled a good 6 inches off the floor, even when he was slouching, and the high back went up over his head. As the silence lengthened, the prince once more felt tension creeping into his shoulders and chest. His hands started to ball up into fists, and he had to make a conscious effort to lay them flat on his lap. So, you and Leah are rogues. Have you been a part of one of those missions? Sabotage missions? Yes, I've been part of a few. It's useful to have a man as big as me on your side to deal with, crowd control. He winked at the prince, and the prince smiled, knowing Tomas thought himself exceedingly clever for using the euphemism. You said most of the sabotage goes unnoticed, but what about the things that do go noticed? Ah, yes. You'll most likely have heard of some, though they were no doubt concealed in propaganda. Your brother Joffred is quite the master of turning disaster into opportunity. The prince felt a swell of anger, but it quickly faded. First, because Tomas was right. One of Joffred's main responsibilities, and indeed talents, was keeping the citizens of the Empire informed about events throughout Lucia. And second, because he realized he didn't care anymore what he thought of the children, or what he said about them. In the Empire, it was death to voice a negative thought about one of the children in public. But here, in the woods, on the outskirts of the exiled kindred's very capital, with a stew and a giant for company, such things seemed remarkably unimportant. All right, so try me. What have you done? Well, personally, I'm responsible for the ongoing problems in expanding the granaries in Tyne. Really? The prince asked, shocked. You are? Tomas nodded, still watching the stew. Of course, it's passed off as the exiled kindred burning crops and killing farmers, and I know that's the story you've been brought up with. But for the past 10 years, I've done something very simple that suspended the granary construction, and I haven't needed to kill a single farmer in order to do it. What have you done? The prince asked. He was unsure if he wanted to know. I break the dams. Easy enough. Bloodless, unless a guard tries to stop me, like what happened a few years back. I nearly didn't make it out then. Some hotshot captain had set an ambush. Too bad he wasn't expecting an ex-blade master. In any case, break 2 or 3 dams and the crops below them fail, flooded with water or else parched. It's a common enough thing to happen by accident. We just make sure to target the ones that Ricard is planning to use for one of his special projects. The prince, who had known for years that a certain number of dams broke every year in the Tinian fields that produced wheat and other grains for the Empire, was shocked. The official story had always been that the dams were poorly constructed, or else that they had been torn down by the Empire in order to make way for better ones. That's incredible, but why would you do that? The grain shortages that were caused in some years, you're responsible for that. Tomas was shaking his head. There are no grain shortages, he said. In Tyne, there are nearly 10 acres of silos full of grain stored every year by the merchants and farmers for sale and distribution across the Empire. The extra grain, the grain we won't allow them to grow, is the grain needed to feed an increased military under the command of Ricard. But there's been no military increase in the past half-century, the prince protested. Not since Ricard attacked. You're sadly misinformed, Princeling. Ricard builds his military every year, in secret. I doubt the other children know, but I'm certain the Empress does. And the dams I break are the ones that control the water to the grain he's trying to grow in secret to feed those armies. But that grain goes to common citizens. No, Tomas said, forcefully. That grain goes to feeding the soldiers that oppress common citizens and try every year to invade this land. The prince let it drop, but the subject felt unresolved. How could the man be sure? How could he know that he wasn't hurting innocents? That's quite an undertaking, the prince said, not knowing what else to say. Indeed. Do you remember the Haven Dam that broke up in Tyne? The one that was being built for 20-something years? Yes, the prince said, astounded. How had they managed to break that? The whole dam had collapsed the day before its completion, which was intended to be a day of celebration. Yes, well, that wasn't us. Just bad luck. But I had you going, didn't I? The giant turned around and winked, and the prince shook his head. Tomas frowned. Is something wrong? No, the prince said. The prince had somehow managed to forget that this man was an exile. He'd been going along, treating Tomas as if he were nothing more than a hunted fugitive, living with other fugitives, trying to escape from a place where they were no longer wanted. But it wasn't that simple. This man wasn't just a passive victim, he was an active outlaw. He had just admitted to treason and sabotage, and beyond that it wasn't some isolated event. It wasn't something he'd done to free or protect himself from harm. It was something he'd done as an attack on the Empire. And what was more, he wasn't the only one. There must be many rogue pairs, though how many the prince couldn't say. How many other things had the kindred done to the Empire? And how many of them, really, had the same good intentions as Tomas? All of this passed through his mind in the few seconds it took Tomas to turn back around, and as the big man went back to stirring the stew, a light went on in the back of the prince's head, and the talisman around his neck seared red-hot and then went cold. He turned his head violently to the left and knew that he was looking north, toward Rourke, because what he felt was the distant glow of the Prince of Oxen at the head of an army, marching right toward him.